In this video, we're going to look at configuring EAP TLS with the Juniper Mist Access Assurance solution. Now, in my lab environment, I have a laptop which I'm going to associate with a Juniper Mist access point, configured with an SSID configured for 802.1x and configured to use the Access Assurance Cloud as its authentication source. Now, we can think of the Access Assurance Cloud just as a cloud-based radiat server that's going to authenticate my user. Now, we also have the Juniper Mist Cloud, and all configuration monitoring of the Access Assurance Cloud is done through the Juniper Mist Cloud. The Access Assurance Cloud is really a headless cloud-based radiat server, whereas the Juniper Mist Cloud is where we do all our configuration and where we get all our stats to monitor the processes that are happening on the Access Assurance Cloud. Now, we're configuring TLS authentication today, and TLS authentication uses certificates for the authentication, both a client-side certificate and a server-side certificate. The server-side certificate is going to be installed and running on the Access Assurance Cloud, and we call it the Mist certificate. And then we're going to need to generate a client certificate for each client that's going to access and be authenticated via the Mist Cloud. Now, while the authentication is being done through certificates-based authentication, we are actually also going to use a third-party identity provider. In this case, it's going to be Microsoft Azure. Now, this wouldn't be to look up user credentials as we would with EAP TLS. This is purely to look up what group the user is a member of. And that is so we can have some control over what users are allowed access to the network. In the case of this example in this lab, we're just going to check if the user is a member of the wireless users group. And if they are, we're going to give them access to the network. Now, in order to use its IDP lookup, we need to know the user's username. And as this is a certificate-based authentication, that username must be contained inside the client certificate. So its username of peter@mqts.co.uk is going to be part of the client certificate. And it'll use that username to look up what group they're in with Microsoft Azure. So that's the high-level lab diagram of what we're going to do. Let's have a look at how that is configured. So here in my lab environment, I've got a number of different wireless LANs for testing different parts of the Access Assurance Suite. But the one we're going to use today in this lab is its NAC TLS SSID that I've got configured. So let's take a closer look at how this is configured. I configured it for WPA3 with 802.1x. And as the authentication server, I've just configured Mist Auth. What that does is say I want to use the Access Assurance Cloud as my radiat server. I could obviously configure a different third-party radiat server, but when we configure Mist Auth, we're saying use the Access Assurance Cloud. And from a point of view of the SSID, that's really all there is in terms of configuration that's needed. What we next need to do is configure the Access Assurance solution, and that is done under the Organization menu and in this Access group of configuration options. So under Access, under Organization. And one of the first things we're going to need to do is handle the certificates that we need. So we obviously need the server-side certificate and we need a client-side certificate. So to generate certificates for my clients just in its lab environment, I've used a piece of software called XCA. And within here, it just allows me to generate a root certificate and then a client certificate. So that's what I've done. I've got this root certificate. I've called it MQTSCA Certificate Authority. And I'm going to export that certificate, which I can do here. And I can export it, put it somewhere, and then I can create a password for it, which I've actually already done it, so I'm not going to do it again, but I can export it ready for importing into the MIST cloud. And then from this certificate authority, I've also then got to generate individual client certificates, and you can see I've generated one called Peter Mackenzie. If I wanted to generate a new certificate, I can come into here, select a certificate authority and say new certificate, which I can do here. Now, one thing I'm going to want to do when generating a client certificate, if I want to do the IDP lookup, is I need to have an alternative name which includes the username. So to do that, I'm going to say it will be something of type email, and then I can put in here peter@mqts.co.uk, and that's a way of adding my username into the certificate. I accidentally added 2 there, but that's my certificate. So, and that's exactly what I did with the certificate that I generated here called Peter Mackenzie. So we'll take a look at that in a bit. So that's handling my client-side certificates. What I then need to do is I need to take my certificate authority certificate and import it into the MIST cloud. So let's have a look at where we would do that. We'd go to Organization and then the Access Certificates. And you can see I've got this certificate here, which is my MQTS Certificate Authority, which I added in. And I just did that by clicking this Add Certificate Authority button, and then I pasted in my certificate into here. What MIST is going to do, and the Access Assurance Solution is going to do, is it will now verify any client certificates that have been generated with its certificate authority. So it's a way of me saying this is a certificate authority from which I'm going to generate all my client certificates. So any certificate that's been generated with its CA is valid and allowed on my network. But then I also need the server-side certificate to put into my client's certificate as a trusted certificate. And we get that from View MIST certificate. Here it is. And we can just literally click download, and it's downloaded something called MIST-CA.cert. So that gives me the MIST cert. So having got those 2 certificates, I can then now configure my client to be able to and add those certificates into my client. So let's just show you what that would look like. I'm just going to pull up my Windows environment here just to show you. So I've got these 2 certificates in here. And again, we can double click on it and click Install Certificate. I've also got my personal certificate, which I can import in as well. We're going to import the personal certificate into what we call our personal certificate folder and the MIT cert into the trusted root certificate. So if I just show you these now, this is under personal and certificates. Here's my certificate I've generated using the MQTSCA. So I've got that installed, and then this MIT cert, if we open it up, you'll see that it's got this funny name. This is the unique identifier from MIST. So if I look in my trusted root certificates, we can see that there's that name again. That's my MIST certificate installed in my trusted root certificate folder. So now my client will be able to validate the server-side certificate, and then it'll be able to use its client certificate to provide its credentials to the network. So that's how we would where we'd import these certificates if it was a Windows machine. Okay, let's have a look now at my auth policies. We can see here in auth policies, I have a policy named TLS. This is a policy that's hopefully going to be used to manage my TLS connections. And what I've said here is that the match criteria is going to be if a request comes in to my access assurance solution, to my Radiate server, and it's an EAP TLS request, and that user is going to be in the wireless users group, so we need to do this IDP lookup. I want to allow network access to it. Now, what is its wireless users? Well, let's take a quick look at what this is. The way we identified its match criteria is with something called labels. So if I come in here to organization under access auth policy labels, you can see I've got something called wireless users, and it says this is a directory attribute. It comes from the directory server, it's the IDP. And I'm saying if they're in a group called wireless users, that's what this means. So it's just saying, have we had a return group from the directory server? It's called wireless users. That's what that label is looking at. You can see how we can also define radius attributes. These are attributes we may want to return back to the access point from the access assurance cloud Radiate server. So we may want to return a VLAN attribute. And if we wanted to do that under our policies, as well as saying, yes, allow access, I could add in and say also place the users in VLAN 99. If it was in with my TLS policy, I'd be adding the VLAN here. Now, I'm not going to specify the VLAN in this example, but you can see how we can do that in this example. So if they're using TLS and they're in the wireless user group, then we're going to do that. Now, under identity providers is where I've got my identity providers defined. And for its TLS one, we'll be using the Azure identity provider, because this is an identity provider I've set up for the domain mqts.co.uk, and that's the email address we put into our certificate. So it's going to, because my user is in this domain, it's going to go off to my Azure identity provider and just do a group lookup. Which group is the user in? In a previous video I recorded on configuring EAP TLS, I talked a little bit more about how we configure identity providers. So do check out that video if you want to know a bit more about configuring identity providers. And that really is all there is to configuring EAP TLS. So let's connect a client and see what we can see. So before I connect my client, you can see that this is currently been hit once today. So I've already hit this rule by one client, but as I connect my client again to this network, we should see this rule hit count increment by 1. So on my client laptop, I've currently got my Wi-Fi turned off, so I'm going to turn it on, and I'm going to connect to the NAC TLS network. Once I've connected, we should start to be able to see information about that connection inside the Mist cloud. So I'm going to refresh my page, and you can see now I've refreshed my page, my hit count is now saying 2. So I've had another client has hit this policy. If I click on the show NAC events, we're looking at all the ones that happen around 2 p.m. They're the ones, that's about my local time now. So we can see that it says NAC server certificate validation success. So let's have a look at this first message. And we can see the client is Peter McKenzie. The SSID is NAC TLS. My username is Peter McKenzie. And then it's got this certificate issuer. This is the certificate that I'm using. So this is the first thing I do is the NAC server is going to validate the client certificate, and because the certificate I used was a certificate generated with the certificate authority we added to Mist, it can validate the client-side certificate. Then the NAC client certificate validation success happens. So actually this first one is the client validating the server certificate, and the second one is actually the client validating the server validating the client certificate. And inside here we can see the client certificate information. So inside here you can see that the email address, my username is there in certificate, so it knows and it can see that what the username is. Because it knows the username and it's validated the client certificate, it can then do an NDP group lookup. And here we are doing a group lookup. You can see we're going off to the Azure IDP, and the role that's been returned is wireless users. So this is coming back saying, yes, Peter at mqtx.co.uk is in the wireless users group. And because I'm in the wireless users group, because this is using the authentication type EAP TLS, that's going to match my access assurance rule, and therefore, finally, NAC client access is allowed. It's going to allow me on to the network. And that is how we configure EAP TLS using the Juniper Mist Access Assurance solution. Thank you for watching.